U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said he plans to meet Danish officials next week to discuss the Trump administration's interest in taking over Greenland.
An ICE immigration officer fatally shot a woman in Minneapolis during a raid on a residential street.
U.S. forces have seized 2 sanctioned oil tankers linked to Venezuela in back-to-back actions in the North Atlantic and the Caribbean. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced on Wednesday that he plans to meet Danish officials next week to discuss the Trump administration's interest in taking over Greenland. Denmark and Greenland sought the meeting after U.S. President Donald Trump doubled down on the idea this week, and the White House refused to rule out using military force to seize the Arctic island, which is a self-governing territory and part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Fears heightened after Trump revived his argument following the capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro in a U.S. military operation last week.
The president always retained the option. Every president, not this president, every president always retains the option. I'm not talking about Greenland. I'm just talking about globally. If the president identifies a threat to the national security of the United States, every president retains the option to address it through military means. As a diplomat, which is what I am now, and what we work on, we always prefer to settle it in different ways. That included in Venezuela.
Trump has argued that the United States needs to control the world's largest island to ensure its own security in the face of rising threats from China and Russia in the Arctic. Rubio has said the Trump administration wants to eventually purchase Greenland rather than use military force, but is considering all options. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen warned earlier this week that a U.S. takeover would amount to the end of NATO. Rubio did not answer a question about whether the Trump administration is willing to risk the NATO alliance by potentially moving ahead with a military option regarding Greenland.
An ICE immigration officer fatally shot a woman in Minneapolis in the United States during a raid on a residential street. In a video circulating online, the woman appears to pull out onto the road before she is stopped by officers who request her to open her door and step out of the car. When the woman proceeds to drive forward in what seems to be an attempt to flee the scene, another officer standing in front of the car draws his gun and shoots at the moving vehicle. The woman's car then sped into 2 parked cars a few meters further, crashing to a stop. In footage provided by eyewitnesses, a total of 3 gunshots can be heard. Images from the scene show 1 gunshot entered through the front windshield. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem called the incident an act of, quote, domestic terrorism, and claimed the woman had tried to run over the officer. U.S. President Donald Trump mirrored this stance and defended ICE. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey reacted with anger, disputing claims that the woman had been a threat to the officer. Frey also accused ICE of sowing chaos and demanded that the agency leave the city.
You shot someone!
They want us to respond in a way that creates a military occupation in our city. They want an excuse to come in and show the kind of force that will create more chaos and more despair.
Hundreds gathered in Minneapolis in the evening of Wednesday to hold a vigil for the woman, as well as to protest ICE raids and Trump's escalating crackdown on immigration.
U.S. forces have seized 2 sanctioned oil tankers linked to Venezuela in back-to-back actions in the North Atlantic and the Caribbean, officials said on Wednesday. The United States had been chasing the first oil tanker, formerly known as the Bella 1, since it evaded a partial U.S. blockade around Venezuela and thwarted an attempt by the U.S. Coast Guard to board it late last month. U.S. European Command said a Coast Guard cutter had pursued the tanker into the waters between Scotland and Iceland. U.S. media reported that Russia had sent a submarine to escort the empty oil tanker. It was reflagged as Russian and renamed the Marinera after turning toward Europe. U.S. officials said the tanker is part of a shadow fleet carrying oil for countries such as Venezuela, Russia, and Iran in violation of U.S. sanctions. The developments are the latest in U.S. President Donald Trump's crackdown on sanctioned oil tankers going to and from Venezuela. The oil tanker guarded by Russia had been en route to Venezuela but was not carrying cargo before it evaded the U.S. blockade. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures brought by Storm Goretti caused chaos across Europe on Tuesday and continued into Wednesday, causing treacherous traffic conditions that left at least 5 people dead in France and significant travel disruptions. Around 100 flights were cancelled at Paris-Charles de Gaulle Airport on Wednesday, leaving passengers stranded. Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport, one of the largest in Europe, announced at least 700 flight cancellations by noon on Wednesday. More than 1,000 people spent the night at Schiphol, the airport said. Camp beds were set up and breakfast was offered to travelers forced to sleep there.
This is my third day in the airport, the second day in this queue. I've been in this queue this morning since about 5 a.m. No, 4:30, somewhere between 4:30 and 5. So, I've been in this queue for nearly 4 hours now.
Meanwhile, children whose schools closed were delighted with an unexpected day off.
De meester kwam naar onze klas toe en toen zeiden ja, we zijn om 2 uur uit. Ja, wij waren helemaal blij. En omdat de andere juffen en meesters die konden niet komen door de trein, omdat het helemaal vol lag met sneeuw.
Further east, Romania, Serbia and Bosnia were also dealing with disruptions due to both heavy snowfall and flooding. A woman died in Bosnia's capital Sarajevo on Monday after a snow-covered tree branch fell on her head. In neighboring Serbia, some western municipalities introduced emergency measures due to bad weather.
The European Commission is stepping up its promises to conclude a trade agreement with Mercosur. The latest announcement was made on Wednesday when the Commission decided to suspend the EU carbon border tax on fertilizers retroactively. This move is widely seen as a further concession to the agriculture sector, which is in revolt against the free trade agreement. This decision meets the requests coming from France and Italy. This concession follows another pledge. A letter from Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on Tuesday promised farmers access to 45 billion euros from the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, as soon as 2028. The Commission assures that this agreement is positive for farmers.
The EU-Mercosur agreement alone is expected to increase EU agri-food exports to the region by 50%. 50%, eliminating tariffs that today can reach up to 55%. And on top of it, this would be also a landmark agreement from the perspective that 344 EU geographical indications are included into this agreement, which would clearly defend Europe's iconic food and drink products.
The latest decisions by Brussels might have persuaded Italy to back the trade deal. Rome's position is crucial as the deal requires a qualified majority of member states to be approved.
Power was restored to thousands of households in Berlin that had been without electricity in freezing temperatures for 4 days, following a suspected far-left attack on high-voltage lines, authorities said on Wednesday. About 45,000 households and 2,200 businesses lost their supply on Saturday morning after a fire on a bridge that carries high-voltage cables over the Teltow Canal in the southwest of the German capital, affecting an estimated 100,000 people. Authorities said they were able to reconnect many to the network gradually, but several days of work were required to repair the damage. It was the longest blackout in the city since the end of World War II.
10 Grad mit Kerzen und so komme ich einigermaßen klar. Taschenlampen habe ich auch, aber die Kälte macht einem wirklich zu schaffen.
Wir haben am meisten Angebote für Hilfe und die Leute, die jetzt hier kommen und was die anfragen, ist tatsächlich Handy aufladen, duschen gehen, damit man wieder in die Wohnung gehen kann und wieder den Tag durchhält.
German authorities say they are investigating sabotage, membership in a terrorist organization, and arson after a little-known far-left grouping claimed to have been responsible.
Iran's army chief threatened preemptive military action against anything deemed a threat to sovereignty as he warned against the dangerous rhetoric targeting the country. The remarks are likely in reference to threats made by U.S. President Donald Trump last week, warning that Washington will come to protesters' rescue if security forces keep killing them. Trump's comments came after initial reports surfaced of security personnel using lethal force, to disperse mass protests held amid dire economic conditions. Iran's army commander-in-chief Amir Hatami warned enemies that Iran is now far stronger and more equipped to defend and respond to any acts of aggression against it. Speaking to a group of students at the military academy, Hatami promised to, quote, cut off the hand of any aggressor if it commits an error. Rights groups say that at least 36 people were killed in protests that started in December across major cities including the capital Tehran. The demonstrations began as inflation continues to float above 40%, contributing to a dramatic rise in food prices, including basic items like flour, rice, and bread.
Saint-Tropez bade adieu to French cinema icon and animal rights activist Brigitte Bardot, who died on the 28th of December at 91. Her husband revealed on Tuesday that she had died from cancer. The funeral procession passed through the French Riviera's port under scattered applause. The far-right supporters' funeral ceremony was broadcast on large screens across town and followed by a private ceremony attended by guests such as French singer Mireille Mathieu and far-right figure Marine Le Pen. Bébé was laid to rest in the family's tomb at Saint-Tropez's Marine Cemetery facing the Mediterranean Sea. Brigitte Bardot was a French actress, model and singer who played in about 50 movies such as And God Created Woman. She retired from cinema before turning 40 to dedicate herself to animal rights.